And with all due respect, Congresswoman, you've never worn the uniform. You've never stood post. You've never made the decisions that keep Americans safe at night. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth leaned forward in his chair at the witness table, his voice rising with each word. Behind him, a phalanx of Pentagon lawyers sat rigid, already knowing where this was going. At the elevated committee dais, Republican members nodded approvingly. This was their strategy: attack the questioner's credentials before she could question his. The June morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the House Armed Services Committee hearing room, but the atmosphere inside was anything but warm. 5 months into his tenure as Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth had been called for an oversight hearing. The official reason: routine check-in. The real reason: the Pentagon was in crisis, and everyone knew it. At the witness table below the committee dais, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression neutral, her hand resting on a leather portfolio. At 43, she'd already made national headlines for her fierce advocacy and viral confrontations. But today felt different. Hegseth had come ready for war. "You're a civil rights attorney from Texas who's been in Congress less than 3 years, Hegseth continued, his Fox News training evident in every gesture, every perfectly timed pause. What could you possibly teach this committee about military leadership, about sacrifice, about what it means to serve our country in uniform?" He gestured broadly, playing to the C-SPAN cameras, his Army National Guard background worn like armor against criticism. "This is political theater," his voice took on a tone of righteous indignation. "This is someone who's never served a day in uniform trying to score political points against a combat veteran who's led men in battle. Someone who earned 2 Bronze Stars. Someone who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan while you were," he paused for effect, letting the implicit criticism hang in the air. "While you were giving speeches in the Texas legislature." Scattered applause from the Republican side of the room. A few Democratic members looked ready to object, but Crockett caught their eyes with the slightest headshake. "Let him finish." Hegseth wasn't done. He'd been briefed on Crockett, her background, her viral moments, her reputation for dismantling unprepared witnesses. He was determined not to be one of them. "Frankly, Congresswoman, it's insulting to the men and women I lead, the 3.4 million service members and civilians at the Department of Defense, to sit here and be questioned by someone who doesn't understand the first thing about military culture, about chain of command, about the weight of decisions that." "Mr. Secretary." 2 words, spoken quietly, but something in Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Hegseth stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still half open. She hadn't moved, hadn't stood up, hadn't raised her hand to interrupt. She'd simply spoken 2 words, and somehow the entire dynamic in the room had shifted, like a tectonic plate finding a new position. The silence was immediate and total. Republicans, who'd been nodding along, suddenly looked uncertain. Democrats leaned forward in their seats. The press gallery, which had been a constant rustle of typing and whispered commentary, went completely quiet. Even the stenographer looked up from her machine. Crockett reached into her leather portfolio with deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. She pulled out a single document and held it up so every camera in the room could capture it clearly. "Mr. Secretary," she repeated, her voice still calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it more menacing. "You've spent the last 5 minutes questioning my qualifications, so let me ask you about yours." She set down the document with the gentleness of someone placing a loaded gun on a table. 3 female generals have resigned from the United States military in the past month. All 3 cited a hostile command climate in their exit interviews conducted by the Department of Defense Inspector General. She paused, letting that number sink in. 3 generals in 1 month. Can you explain why? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. It had weight and texture. It pressed down on everyone in the room like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Hegseth's mouth opened, closed. His jaw worked as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. His eyes darted to his chief of staff, seated directly behind him, who was now frantically checking a tablet, clearly blindsided by this line of questioning. His hand reached for his water glass, a telltale stalling tactic that every trial lawyer in America would recognize. 10 seconds passed, then 15, then 20. The press gallery, usually unable to maintain silence for more than a moment, had gone completely still. Phones were out, but nobody was typing. Everyone was watching, waiting. Finally, Hegseth opened his mouth to speak. Actually, Crockett interrupted, not raising her voice, but somehow filling every inch of the chamber. Let me be more specific. She pulled out another document. This one had an official Department of Defense seal visible at the top. Lieutenant General Patricia Hammond, 32 years of service, 2 combat deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, the first woman to hold that position. She submitted her resignation 3 weeks ago. Crockett looked up from the paper, her eyes locking with Hegseth's. Would you like to know what she wrote in her exit interview? She didn't wait for an answer. I'm reading directly from the Inspector General's report. The current leadership at the Department of Defense has made it clear through both policy discussions and personal interactions that female officers are not valued or wanted in combat roles. The hostile environment created by the Secretary's public statements and private attitudes has made it impossible for me to effectively serve. The room erupted. Democratic members were on their feet. Republican members were frantically checking their phones. This was clearly news to them, too. The press gallery transformed into a frenzy of typing and whispered phone calls. Hegseth's entire row of Pentagon lawyers were now conferring urgently, passing notes, pulling up documents on tablets. The committee chairman, Representative Michael Turner of Ohio, gavelled frantically for order. The committee will come to order. The Congresswoman still has the floor. Crockett sat calmly through the chaos, her hands folded on the table in front of her, waiting. When the room finally settled, she continued as if there had been no interruption. That was 3 weeks ago, Mr. Secretary. Her voice was measured, but there was steel underneath. General Hammond was followed by Major General Lisa Jaster, who cited regression to 1950s attitudes about women's capabilities. She was followed by Brigadier General Sarah Thompson, who wrote, and again, I'm quoting directly from DoD documents, I cannot in good conscience serve under leadership that fundamentally questions my right to defend my country. Crockett set down the papers and leaned forward slightly. So here's my question, Mr. Secretary. Not about my qualifications, not about my service, about yours. She let the pause extend, making sure every word that followed would be heard clearly. How many more generals are we going to lose before you figure out how to lead them?